Just before Christmas, we read the verses that come immediately before this very long genealogy. And the verses, we read the verses that come immediately after this very long genealogy. And what comes after this genealogy in Matthew's gospel is the story of the Immaculate Conception, where the angel appears to Joseph and explains to Joseph that Mary is with child, and Joseph decides to stay with Mary. So the story of the virgin birth. And it's an interesting contrast, I think, that this very long and detailed genealogy would precede the story of the virgin birth. Because the virgin birth would seem to advance the notion that Jesus just appeared in history without any historical precedent, without any action from people. Jesus just came. But then Matthew gives us 42 generations of Jesus' ancestor. His dad, his dad, his dad, his dad, his dad. So these two ideas sort of seem in conflict. On the one hand, Jesus is an unsolicited gift from God. On the other hand, we know his whole family tree. A genogram is a family tree that spells out emotional history and trauma and the specifics of relationships. There's a sample genogram on the cover of your bulletin this morning, and you can see the key with the symbols detailing all the different possibilities of relationships in a family: harmony, closeness, estrangement, hostility, abuse, distant. It's very detailed. When I was in divinity school, we had to prepare a genogram for our own family. And if this sounds terrifying to you, it absolutely was. So I first made the family tree. That's the easy part. But then I looked at the symbols that were offered, and I thought about all the things in my own family that maybe we've referenced before but never named. And then I got busy with my colored markers and my squiggly lines, and I saw the genogram. And suddenly my family made a whole lot more sense to me. I made more sense to me. I handed this genogram in to my professor. She looked at it, made a few notes, handed it back to me, and I sent it to the paper shredder. No, thank you. I didn't want to spend any more time looking at my family like this. So I'm able to put my family history and whatever genogram I made in the paper shredder, but a whole lot more is known about Jesus' family than will ever be known about any of our families. There's no burning these first 16 verses of Matthew. We know these people and we know their stories. And maybe you're familiar with some of these people from a lifetime of church going, from going to Sunday school, or even just from worshiping here this fall. This is a familiar cast of characters. So there is Father Abraham, who passes his wife off as his sister a couple times when they are in foreign kingdoms. There is Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who welcomes a few Israelite men into her home office. There's Ruth, who sleeps at the feet of Boaz and shocks Boaz with her forwardness. There is the wife of Uriah. Bathsheba is not even named in Jesus' genealogy, but I don't think it's because she is a nameless person. I think it is because Matthew is not letting us forget about the awful thing that David did with the wife of another man. And then there is Mary and Joseph at the end. And we know from our story a couple weeks ago in church that the angel was nice enough to appear to Joseph and explain what was actually going on with Mary's pregnancy. But we shouldn't presume that the same angel made the same announcement to everybody else in the neighborhood, disabusing them of whatever gossip or thoughts they had about the peculiar arrival of this baby. I bet every person in this room, if you were really honest and made a genogram, you'd have some squiggly colored lines too. And it would be embarrassing. It would make you hurt. It might even make you feel ashamed. And that's why you all need to read the Bible more and come to church more. Not so that your lives can be set on the right course, but so that you feel less bad about your life, because your life compared to the stories of the people in the Bible aren't that bad. You're all pretty vanilla, I think. What do we do about families? If you ask me, every family is a great big problem. Of course, there are some families that have great big problems, and I'll let your imaginations fill in the specifics for what those great big problems might be. But even families that are loving and successful and bright have problems too. I know some families where mom or dad are maybe a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer or a judge or an investment banker or an ambassador, highly successful. They love their children. And let's say Junior is good at a lot of things too. He could be a poet, or maybe he would just want to wait tables, or just want to stay at home and raise kids. But for some reason, he knows that that is not an acceptable calling in his highly esteemed family. And so he goes to medical school and gets the fancy degree and works 80 hours a week because he has to. And he starts his own family and has his own kids who have their own interests. But the expectations are still there. This recurs again and again and again throughout families. These expectations, this pressure, this failure to recognize our kids wanting the same things that maybe we wanted, this inability to extend grace that we ourselves never got. Families are really hard. I think the reason that I was supposed to make a genogram like this while I was a student in divinity school was so that I could better understand myself and my own family. And I think it's helpful to do this. I can see aspects of myself, even in family members that I'm not particularly close to. And all the studies that have ever been conducted on twins separated at birth bear this forth. Maybe you have a twin that you've never met, and maybe this person is halfway across the country and they're working on a project in the garage, and they stick their tongue out in the same way that you stick your tongue out when you're working on a project in your garage. Our families can just seem like our destiny. You came from the family you came from. You are the way you are. That's how it is. Look at a genogram. Look at the first 17 verses of Matthew, those 42 generations. And then comes Christ. And that's where the narrative is interrupted. That's where the resemblances change, where grace introduces itself. Matthew's genealogy isn't some Darwinian exercise of evolution in which each generation is getting progressively better and better and better before it results in this entirely new species, Jesus Christ, the God-man. That's not how it goes. When we line up everybody in Matthew's genealogy, we see kind of a wild cast of characters. The people aren't really getting any better. They all are just who they are. Imperfect, complicated, odd, and then out of nowhere comes a little baby. Out of nowhere comes Christ. And the appearance of Christ changes the family tree. It changes the genogram. Because Christ, on Christmas, becomes a part of every family tree. And with the appearance of Christ on a family tree, there's also a line that connects Christ to every person on that family tree. And if there was a symbol for this, the line would indicate grace. Grace where there is hostility and fracture and brokenness and abuse. Grace for every person in a family tree connected directly to Christ. Grace for Tina and Tom, who are estranged. Grace for Paul, who's hostile. Grace for Vivian and the conflict with Max. Grace for every person in a family tree. Grace for every person that you just spent the past Christmas with. even when times were pretty difficult. Grace for every person and grace for you. On Christmas Eve, we said that on this glorious evening, the Word became flesh and earth was joined to heaven. It was a beautiful evening here. There was a lot going on, and this is a lot to take in. Word, flesh, earth, heaven. All these things together. What does it mean? It means God comes into our world, into our very difficult families. And God relates to all of us and changes the relationship and the way that a family tree might look. And if we can see these lines of grace connecting to every person on the family tree, if we can believe this, that we are recipients of this grace, when we make a genogram and we finish up, we don't need to feel ashamed and awful about it. We don't need to burn it or put it in the paper shredder. We can recognize the prevalence, the ubiquity, the reality of grace, even in our difficult lives. Amen.